I created the document that protects your freedoms, yet I owe those same liberties to those I enslaved. Fellow citizens, I am James Madison, 4th President of these United States and principal architect of our Constitution. What you are about to discover is not merely the story of a man, but the birth of ideas that continue to shape your liberties today. By the conclusion of our discourse, you shall possess insights into the delicate balance between power and freedom that few Americans truly comprehend. You believe you understand the origins of your rights, yet what you don't realize is that your most cherished freedoms emerged not from unanimous agreement, but through bitter compromise and profound contradiction. The document protecting your right to speak freely was crafted by a man who owned human beings as property. I submit to you that the Constitution you revere was nearly rejected entirely. And the most surprising truth, the Bill of Rights you cherish was initially considered dangerous and unnecessary by many who signed the very Constitution it amends. This contradiction between proclaimed liberty and practiced tyranny requires our deliberation today. I entered this world in 1751, born to wealth and privilege on a Virginia plantation. What shaped my thinking, however, was not comfort but observation of injustice. Allow me to share a formative moment that altered my conception of liberty forever. In my 23rd year, I witnessed Baptist preachers imprisoned in Orange County, Virginia. Their crime: preaching without proper licenses from the established Anglican Church. These men, speaking their conscience on matters of faith, were jailed by the very government sworn to protect citizens' welfare. This persecution occurred not under some distant monarchy, but in Virginia itself, my home. I observed how readily a majority might oppress a minority when granted such power. This revelation would guide my thinking on government's proper scope and limitations for decades hence. The question confronting me then, the same that confronts you now, was fundamental. How might we construct a government powerful enough to function effectively, yet restrained enough to preserve individual liberty? This paradox became my life's work. Consider 3 principles I derived from these early experiences. 1, religious liberty must be absolute, not merely tolerated. 2, majority rule, unchecked, threatens minority rights. 3, constitutional. Constraints on government power protect individual freedom. But my path from observing injustice to crafting our Constitution required intellectual preparation few Americans comprehend today. While many portray the founding generation as divinely inspired, I assure you our ideas emerged from rigorous study. I immersed myself in political philosophy, analyzing historical republics and their inevitable failures. What most accounts of our founding neglect to mention is the extent of our intellectual preparation. I procured over 400 volumes on government theory before the Constitutional Convention, studying ancient confederacies and their fatal flaws. This was no romantic endeavor, but methodical analysis of governmental design. A personal anecdote may illuminate this preparation. In the winter of 1786, as Shays' rebellion threatened Massachusetts, I retreated to my library at Montpelier. There, surrounded by historical texts, I compiled comprehensive notes on why confederacies throughout history had failed. These notes, unknown to most citizens today, became the intellectual foundation for our constitutional system. These documents I hold momentarily contain observations that would reshape a continent. Yet my preparation faced its greatest test when revolution gave way to governance. The summer of 1787 found delegates from across our young nation assembled in Philadelphia. The Articles of Confederation had proven woefully inadequate, powerless to regulate commerce, unable to collect revenue, incapable of defending our borders. What you've likely never considered is how close we came to dissolution. The states functioned essentially as 13 separate countries, each with different currencies, trade policies, and interests. Our experiment in self-governance stood at the precipice of failure. Allow me to reveal a truth obscured by patriotic mythology. I arrived in Philadelphia with a radical plan that would fundamentally alter our government structure. The Virginia Plan, largely my creation, proposed representation based on population, a concept that would advantage my state while transforming our loose confederation into a truly national government. 3 critical innovations I proposed remain cornerstones of your government today. 1, separation of powers among 3 branches. 2, a bicameral legislature with proportional representation 3, federal authority to regulate interstate commerce. Yet what most histories fail to emphasize is that these ideas faced vehement opposition. The smaller states rightfully feared domination by the larger ones. Our deliberations nearly collapsed entirely over this fundamental tension. If you find these insights into our constitutional origins valuable, I encourage you to signal your approval through the designated mechanism and consider regular subscription to these historical explorations. The Constitution's creation represented merely the opening salvo in a greater battle, ratification by the states. Many citizens feared this new government would threaten their hard-won liberties. What few Americans today realize is that I collaborated intimately with Alexander Hamilton, a man who would later become my political adversary, to defend our Constitution through a series of essays now known as the Federalist Papers. Under the pseudonym, we crafted 85 essays explaining and justifying each constitutional provision. I personally authored 29 of these papers, including Federalist No. 10, which addressed a concern fundamental to Republican government, yet rarely discussed in contemporary discourse. I submit to you that Federalist No. 10 contains perhaps my most significant contribution to political thought, the concept that a large, diverse republic actually protects liberty better than a small one. This ran contrary to all prevailing wisdom of the time. The document I hold momentarily contains my argument that factional interests, what you might call special interests, pose less danger in a large republic where competing factions check each other's power, preventing any single group from dominating government. Consider this contrarian insight. The very size and diversity of America that many feared would make governance impossible actually serves as its greatest protection against tyranny. This principle continues to function in your time, though few recognize its operation. Perhaps the most profound irony of my political career lies in my relationship with the Bill of Rights. What citizens today might find astonishing is that I initially opposed this addition to our Constitution. My reasoning, though counterintuitive, was logical. I feared enumerating specific rights might imply that those not listed remained unprotected. Furthermore, I believed the Constitution's structure itself, with its separated powers and checks and balances, would sufficiently protect liberty. Yet I witnessed the genuine concerns of my fellow citizens. Many states would not ratify without explicit protections for individual rights. Political necessity demanded compromise. This represents a critical lesson in governance often forgotten today. Principled compromise advances liberty more effectively than rigid ideological purity. I adapted my position to accommodate legitimate concerns while preserving our constitutional framework. Let me share a personal revelation that changed my approach. During ratification debates in Virginia, I encountered citizens genuinely fearful of government power. These were not abstract theoretical concerns, but lived experiences of people who had recently fought against governmental tyranny. Their apprehension was reasonable and deserved address. The Bill of Rights I subsequently drafted protected one freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition 2. The right to bear arms within a well-regulated militia 3. Protection against unreasonable searches and seizures 4. Due process in criminal proceedings 5. Rights retained by the people beyond those enumerated. If these constitutional insights prove valuable to your understanding of liberty, I encourage you to indicate your approval and consider regular subscription for future historical examinations. The document was, but the struggle to define America had only begun. Alexander Hamilton, once my collaborator, advanced a vision of government I found increasingly dangerous to Republican principles. What historians often neglect to emphasize is how dramatically Hamilton's financial system threatened to undermine our constitutional design. His proposal for a national bank, assumption of state debts, and manufacturing subsidies concentrated economic power in ways that benefited financial elites at the expense of agricultural interests. A personal anecdote may illuminate this pivotal moment. In 1791, Hamilton submitted his report on manufactures to Congress, advocating federal support for industrial development. Reviewing this document in my chambers, I recognized not merely economic policy, but a fundamental reinterpretation of constitutional authority. This represented the first great debate over constitutional interpretation, strict versus loose construction, that continues to this day. Hamilton claimed the Constitution's necessary and proper clause permitted whatever served national interest. I maintained this interpretation rendered constitutional limitations meaningless. 3. Fundamental differences emerged between Hamilton's vision and mine. 1. Hamilton envisioned America as a commercial and manufacturing power. I sought to preserve our agrarian character too. Hamilton favored a powerful central government. I defended states' rights and local authority. 3. Hamilton believed in rule by the better sort of men. I advocated broader democratic participation. These differences compelled Thomas and myself to establish the Democratic-Republican Party, America's first organized opposition, to counter Federalist policies. In 1809, I assumed the presidency during perilous times. Europe was engulfed in the wars, with both Britain and France violating American neutrality. Our young nation's sovereignty faced its greatest test since independence. What few historical accounts properly emphasize is the impossible position we faced. Britain impressed our sailors into their navy and seized our vessels. France confiscated American ships trading with Britain. Economic sanctions through my predecessor's Embargo Act had devastated our own economy without altering European behavior. Let me share a personal reflection from this difficult period. In June 1812, with diplomatic options exhausted, I submitted a war message to Congress. Signing this document, I recognized the profound risk of confronting the world's greatest naval power with our limited military capability. Yet principles of sovereignty and national honor demanded action. The ensuing conflict severely tested our national resolve. British forces invaded Washington itself, burning the White House and Capitol in August 1814. My wife Dolley and I fled the executive mansion mere hours before British troops arrived. The document I hold momentarily contains an often overlooked truth about this conflict. Despite military setbacks, the War of 1812 ultimately strengthened American nationalism and independence. The Hartford Convention, where New England Federalists contemplated secession, collapsed as news of Jackson's victory at New Orleans and the Treaty of Ghent reached American shores. This war, which I had reluctantly initiated, ultimately destroyed the Federalist Party and ushered in the era of good feelings a period of national unity that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. I must now address what historians rightfully identify as the most profound contradiction of my life and of our founding generation, the institution of slavery. What requires honest acknowledgement is that I, who articulated principles of liberty and natural rights, remained a slaveholder throughout my life. This fundamental contradiction cannot be excused by historical context alone. At Montpelier, my Virginia estate, over 100 enslaved persons labored to maintain my comfort and status. Their labor enabled my political career, my education, and my very ability to contemplate liberty while they remained in bondage. This represents perhaps the most significant blind spot in our founding vision, our failure to extend the principles of liberty and equality to all persons regardless of race. The consequences of this moral failure continue to reverberate through American society today. I did recognize slavery's incompatibility with our stated principles. In my later years, I supported the American Colonization Society, which sought to establish freed slaves in Liberia. Yet I never freed my own enslaved people during my lifetime, not even in my will as Washington had done. 3 painful truths must be acknowledged regarding my relationship with slavery. 1, I recognized slavery's moral wrong yet continued to benefit from it personally too. I failed to use my influence to meaningfully challenge the institution. 3, I prioritized national unity and economic interests above human freedom. This contradiction represents not merely personal hypocrisy, but a foundational flaw in our constitutional system, one that would require civil war and constitutional amendments to partially remedy. If you find this honest examination of our founding contradictions valuable, I encourage you to signify your approval and consider subscription for future historical explorations. As I approach the conclusion of our discourse, let us examine the enduring legacy of the constitutional system I helped design. What most citizens fail to appreciate fully is how our constitutional framework has adapted to circumstances the founding generation could never have anticipated. The document was designed not as perfect or immutable, but adaptable through amendment and interpretation. A personal reflection may illuminate this intention. In my final years at Montpelier, visitors frequently sought my definitive interpretation of constitutional provisions. I reminded them that the Constitution belongs not to its framers, but to the living generation who must apply its principles to contemporary challenges. The system of checks and balances, federalism, and enumerated powers has proven remarkably resilient across more than 2 centuries. Yet this resilience derives not from rigid adherence to original understanding, but from thoughtful adaptation to changing circumstances. 4 aspects of our constitutional design have proven particularly enduring. 1, separation of powers preventing concentration of authority; 2, federalism, balancing national needs with local governance; 3, judicial review ensuring constitutional compliance; 4, amendment process allowing formal evolution. What would likely surprise my contemporaries is how judicial interpretation has become central to constitutional development. The Marshall Court's establishment of judicial review in v. Madison, a power not explicitly granted in the Constitution, fundamentally shaped how constitutional principles evolve. Fellow citizens, as we conclude our examination, let us consider how the principles we established continue to inform your contemporary governance. What most political discourse today fails to acknowledge is that our constitutional system was designed not for efficiency, but for liberty. The frustrations citizens express about governmental dysfunction often reflect features, not bugs, in our constitutional design. The system intentionally makes rapid, dramatic change difficult. It requires broad consensus, compromise, and deliberation. This can appear as gridlock or inefficiency, but it serves as protection against momentary passions overwhelming reasoned judgment. I submit to you that the greatest current threat to our constitutional system lies not in any particular policy dispute, but in the abandonment of constitutional norms and procedures in pursuit of partisan advantage. When institutional constraints are viewed as obstacles to be overcome rather than protections to be preserved, liberty itself is endangered. 3 principles from our founding remain essential today. 1, constitutional constraints on government power protect individual liberty. 2, compromise enables governance in a diverse republic. 3, respect for constitutional processes transcends partisan objectives. My final question for your consideration: how might you balance the legitimate desire for governmental action with the essential protection of constitutional constraints? I encourage you to examine your own state's constitution alongside the federal document. Compare their protections, limitations, and structures. Understanding these parallel systems illuminates the full scope of your rights and responsibilities as citizens. In our next historical exploration, we shall examine my complex relationship with Alexander Hamilton, how 2 collaborators became bitter rivals, and how our competing visions continue to shape American governance today. I am James Madison, architect of your Constitution and servant to liberty's cause. As always, remember that liberty requires eternal vigilance, for no document alone can preserve freedom without citizens committed to its principles. Until our next discourse, I remain your humble servant in the cause of liberty and constitutional governance. Introduced in opening hook, partially addressed in segments on constitutional design, fully resolved in dedicated segment on slavery with honest acknowledgement of moral failure. Introduced in opening sequence, built tension through constitutional convention segment. Resolved in Bill of Rights segment with explanation of Madison's change in position. Introduced in Federalist Papers segment. Developed through constitutional interpretation differences. Resolved in Rivalry segment with explanation of fundamental philosophical differences. Further payoff promised in. Teaser for next video, introduced in Presidency segment. Developed through personal anecdote about fleeing Washington. Resolved with explanation of how the war paradoxically strengthened nationalism won. What most accounts of our founding neglect to mention is the extent of our intellectual preparation. I procured over 400 volumes on government theory before the Constitutional Convention, studying ancient confederacies and their fatal flaws. 2. I submit to you that Federalist number 10 contains perhaps my most significant contribution to political thought, the concept that a large, diverse republic actually protects liberty better than a small one. This ran contrary to all prevailing wisdom of the time. 3. Perhaps the most profound irony of my political career lies in my relationship with the Bill of Rights. What citizens today might find astonishing is that I initially opposed this addition to our Constitution. 4. What historians often neglect to emphasize is how dramatically Hamilton's financial system threatened to undermine our constitutional design.